Alaa here. Now the sound that you are hearing here, we're on the top of a hill, and I think you can probably see there are lots of Israelis gathered around who are cheering when they see these kinds of Israeli strikes.
In the name of Allah, God, the most gracious, the most merciful. If you happen to have stumbled upon this content somewhere in the corners of the internet, perhaps you saw the thumbnail somewhere and you thought to click on it and give it a listen, I'd like to thank you in the beginning and to introduce myself. My name is Alaa ElSharif. I am a Libyan American, currently residing with my family in Tripoli, Libya. But more importantly than my nationality, I am a human being. I am a father, a husband, a son, a sibling, co-worker, a colleague, and a friend. And having feelings and emotions and empathy, I cannot sit back and watch silently the massacre that is unfolding in front of us every single day in Palestine and in Gaza and remain silent. In a previous life, I used to produce and present podcast programs about, believe it or not, amongst many things, professional wrestling. And I used to enjoy sharing my analysis and my opinions about, we'll call it the sport of professional wrestling, with my many listeners around the world. But ever since this begun on the 7th of October, I find it in bad taste. I find it silly to sit behind a mic and talk about professional wrestling and who moved to which promotion and who won the match and etc. Knowing that there are thousands of people right now living under a constant, non-stop, relentless bombing campaign when they have no electricity, no running water, no food, no medicine, no fuel, nothing. How many people have died so far? I'm afraid the numbers are rising. It was 10,000, 11,000. As I'm recording now, it's surpassed 12,000. God knows how many people will have died by the time you listen to this. And I hope and pray that this stops soon. And the question that is on every person's mind is, why? Why is this happening? Why is a small strip of land overpopulated with near 2 million people being bombed non-stop 24/7 now for near 40 days? A lot of people will say it was because of the terror, quote unquote, attacks on the 7th of October. Now, ever since it's begun, a person like Piers Morgan has benefited a lot. His YouTube channel is booming. He's getting millions upon millions of views, hosting people from both sides of the, I'm not going to call it a conflict, it's a genocide. And the first question he asks everybody that he hosts is, do you condemn Hamas? Do you consider what happened on the 7th of October a terror attack? And if he doesn't get the answer that he wants, he will give them hell. Interestingly, one of his guests, a famous author, Jordan Peterson, used that exact same word, give them hell, in a tweet that he sent to Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister. Give them hell, Bibi. That's what he said. And apparently, Netanyahu didn't even need that goading on. He's been giving the people of Gaza hell since the 7th of October. I'd like to attempt to answer that question. What do I think of what happened on the 7th of October? And I want to take it a step back as well, and we'll try together to talk about this, because I've noticed in response to many of those episodes on Piers Morgan's channel, and specifically the ones where he had Bassem Youssef, the famous Egyptian satirist. I've noticed reactions to those videos. And what really drew my attention in those reactions is the level of, for lack of a better word, ignorance that the people who are responding and reacting to those videos displayed. I didn't think that the people in the West were in the dark this much. I didn't know that they were this deluded. They don't know what's going on. The things that Bassem Youssef said on the Piers Morgan show, as acute as they were, but they're not revelations. These are things that people in the Middle East consider common knowledge. This is stuff that we've been taught in schools since we were children. We know all about this. And I was appalled to realize that the people in the West who were reacting to those episodes had no idea about what was going on. They don't know what Palestine is. They don't know how the state of Israel came to existence. They don't know anything. There are people who think that this began on the 7th of October. But who are the Palestinian people? Who are Hamas? What is Gaza? How is Gaza a part of Palestine? How does Israel come into play to all this? They don't know anything about this. Now, I'm not going to try in this video and educate you all on all of these things because it would take me hours to cover it all. And the material, in fact, is out there. You can just go and Google it or Bing it or whatever. You can use whatever search engine you like. I'm not going to give them an advertisement. You can use whatever you like. You can ask ChatGPT or you.com or whatever AI website, and they'll tell you the story. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of documentaries made by serious journalists talking about this. There are books, in fact, in libraries, filling shelves that tell about this. Unfortunately, as it may appear, the people of the world today are too busy watching their TikToks and oogling at girls shaking their booties and dancing. And they're too busy to really educate themselves about these facts that are happening in the world. But to make it simple, what happened on the 7th of October isn't the cause, it was an effect. It was a symptom of a larger disease, a more serious disease, the disease of occupation. The people of Palestine have been occupied for over 75 years. They've been driven out of their country, out of their lands. They've been kicked out and replaced by another race, by another people that has been working relentlessly to wipe them out of existence. As I begun this video, I live in Libya, and some of my best friends are Palestinians. Teachers who taught my parents in their childhood are Palestinians. Just last summer, I had an eye condition and I went to a doctor, and the doctor who treated me was a Palestinian. We have a lot of Palestinians here in Libya. You want to know why we have so many Palestinians in Libya? Because those poor Palestinians were kicked out of their country. And they're widespread all over the Arab world. You're going to find them everywhere. You're going to find them in Libya and Tunisia and Morocco and Algeria. Wherever you go, you're going to find Palestinians. You're going to find them everywhere except their country. And the reason for that is what we call, as Arabs, a Nakba, the catastrophe. In 1948, when the state of Israel was recognized by the United Nations, and this led to a war between the Arab states at the time, who were defeated, and Israel, backed by the United States, Great Britain, and France. And the Israelis won in that war, and they managed to take the land. And then there were several wars fought after that, in 1956, in 1967, and in 1973. And the result of the majority of those wars was that Israel expanded its borders even more, taking more land, occupying more land, and kicking out more Palestinians and more Arabs. Now we have a crisis where the remainder of the Palestinians in what is now known as Israel are either in a very small, narrow strip of land known as the Gaza sector in the east, or on the West Bank The living conditions of the people in Gaza are inhumane. They are under complete and total control by the Israelis, who can cut off the electricity and water whenever they want to. They don't have access to clean water. They don't have access to jobs, education. It's horrible. People in Gaza are born dead. They don't have hope. They don't have hope. That's how people there are quote unquote living. It's not a life. People are desperate. People are impoverished. They're poor. They're hungry. And they can't get up. They're not allowed to leave Gaza. I mentioned just a little while ago that I have a lot of Palestinian friends. And as close as we are, they can't share any of my interests. I'm a person of vast interests. I love books and novels and movies and sports and professional wrestling and all that. And I can never get into a meaningful conversation about any of these topics with my Palestinian friends. Do you know why? It's because they are occupied. And I mean the word pun intended. They're occupied by only one issue: their land. And will they ever go home? And politics. And this conundrum that they're living in. These are people without hope. For this reason, when you lock a population of people, I'm not even going to call it a prison, because the conditions in prison are better than the Gaza Strip. When you put them in an open occupation camp like this, and you deprive them of all of their human rights, what do you expect? If you lock up a tiger and you don't feed that tiger, and that tiger just stays there in the cage, pacing it, back and fro, hungry, and then it gets to break out for whatever reason, what's the tiger going to do? I'll tell you, it's going to eat you. That's what it's going to do. You have a population of people who've been starved, impoverished, deprived of their rights, and they've been locked up like this for years upon years. When a faction of them get to break out, they're going to take revenge. They're going to be violent, because no one gave them another option. No one gave them hope. These aren't people who are occupied with sports and entertainment and fun things to do. No, these are people who are just looking for their next meal. These are people who are haunted not by their far future like most of us. They're just thinking about where the next meal is going to come from. They're worried about how they're going to go to bed at night. So, as violent as what happened on the 7th of October is, and I'm not trying to justify it, personally, I think it was wrong. I think it was miscalculated. I think it was reckless. I think that the people who did it in total disrespect and disregard for human life. They knew when doing this that they would bring upon their people the full wrath of the Israeli military apparatus. And they know, just like we all do, that the Israelis are bloody and ruthless. And if anything, they're not merciful. And they did it goading the Israelis into a bloodshed that they thought would expose them to the world. I think that's reckless. I think that the price was far too high, and the death toll is too high. And I only want to know, when is this going to end? How many more Palestinians have to die in response to what happened on the 7th of October? The 7th of October was one day. This has been near 40 days. And it's not stopping. It's disproportionate. And the majority of the people who are dying are women and children and disabled people and elderly. What did those people do? What did they do to deserve this? I heard some people somewhere say stuff like, well, they elected Hamas to be their government, so now they deserve what's coming to them. I read that somewhere and I heard it from a few American officials. And in response to that, let's just say this. The last election held in Palestine was in 2006. That was near 17 years ago. The majority of the population in Gaza are below 16 years old. The people who are dying now were born after that election. And that was the last election ever held. Hamas came to power in 2006, but after that there were no more elections. The ballot boxes were taken away and no more elections were held in Palestine. So to blame the people of Gaza, who perhaps, we don't even know if these were democratically held elections, we don't know if they were transparent and fair, but even if they were, there is such thing as voting your candidate out later, or perhaps a recall. That isn't available in Palestine. They're stuck with Hamas, good or bad, they're stuck with them. There hasn't been an election since 2006. We can't punish people for a quote-unquote mistake that took place 17 years ago. People change. Maybe at the time they thought that Hamas would be a better alternative to the PLO, which was at the time a horrible government, ridden with corruption. Perhaps the people thought that the alternative would be better and they voted for the alternative, Hamas, which at the time seemed to them like a better option. But then they had buyer's regret. But now you're unable to vote them out. It's not fair to punish them for the mistakes of their government. It's not. And they're being bombed and shelled with one of the most advanced military arsenals in the world. The US and the West arm Israel with billions of dollars worth of weapons, the most advanced, and some of it is precision weaponry. And I have a question here. If Israel was really interested in taking out Hamas, and by the way, that's how you say it, Hamas, it's not Hamas like the Israelis say. It's Hamas with a ha, and if you can't pronounce the ha, you can change it to an H. For example, Hassan, you call him Hassan, you don't call him Hassan, so it's Hamas. Let's say that the Israelis were really interested in taking out Hamas. Why don't they use their smart, intelligent, precision weapons? Why don't they trace them through their phones, their internet, their credit cards? They can find them and use drones, for instance, and just target them. I don't think that's impossible. The heads of Hamas actually live outside of Gaza. They don't live there. They're in Qatar and in Turkey. Why don't you go to the ICC? Why don't you have them prosecuted by the ICC and extradited from Qatar and Turkey and handed over to The Hague? Why are you taking justice into your own hands? Why are you bombing mindlessly innocent women and children? You're hitting hospitals, you're hitting schools, you're hitting refugee camps. I don't think any person with a straight sense of mind believes that when you target the UNRWA schools and hospitals and refugee camps, that you're really targeting Hamas. That doesn't make any sense. You're going for maximum carnage. You're going for maximum casualties. You're only wreaking death and destruction and bloodshed wherever you go. And the scenes are terrifying. Do you think that by bombing Palestine like this, you're going to wipe out Hamas? No. You're just going to create more Hamases. Because whenever you kill one person, you're going to indoctrinate his whole family. His brothers, his children, his neighbors, his friends, they're all going to become freedom fighters. They're all going to want to take revenge. This is how you solve this. This is wrong. If the quote-unquote terrorists were in Manhattan or Chicago or wherever, I don't think you'd bomb the whole city to root them out. If you have a few termites or your bed was infested with bugs, I don't think you'd just bomb the house to kill the insects, right? You'd find a way to do it more precisely, more surgically. But what you're doing now is you're wiping out a total population of people, a whole race of people, just to get revenge. And just so that you can annex that land and drive the remainder of its people out. And the problem is, we can easily just turn off our televisions. But the war isn't turning off there in Gaza. It's not. I feel guilty. I really do. Just going to bed at night, safe and sound, and waking up safe and sound with food on my table and a roof over my head and clothes on my back, thinking of those innocent people there, living in the dark, without electricity, without running water, without food, without medicine, without fuel. And believe me, oh you who are listening to me now, I've been through this before. As a citizen of Tripoli, we've had this on a smaller scale a few years ago. In case you don't know the story, and I promise not to bore you with the details, but a few years ago, a renegade general here in Libya by the name of Khalifa Haftar, he's a dual citizen, Libyan-American, decided to wage a war on the UN-recognized government in Tripoli. And he led an army, a ragtag bunch of militias, aided by, guess who? Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, France, Russian mercenaries, Wagner, and some other countries, Jordan, Chad. And they came up to us here in Tripoli, and they held a siege around our city for a year and 2 months. And they started bombing us. Pretty similar to what the Israelis are doing now, but they don't have the same advanced weaponry. And they bombed us non-stop for 14 months. They cut off our water, they cut off our electricity, they cut off fuel to the city, and we lived in those conditions. And my home was hit, and we were displaced, and I was separated from my family, and we had a very, very hard time. And we're still suffering of the effects of that until this day. And we, till this day in Tripoli, we're living on the brim of a gun. At any minute this can happen again. It can break out at the drop of a hat, because the world doesn't want to do anything to end the danger that Haftar represents. I tell you this to tell you that I am familiar with what is happening in Gaza, even though what I went through isn't a fraction of what they are going through now. But I can emphasize, and I understand the pain, and I understand the fear, and I know what it feels like not knowing when your next meal is coming from. And I know what it feels like going to sleep in the dark and the cold without having lights on, or a heater, or even a blanket. I know those feelings. And anybody who's lived in similar conditions can emphasize. I want any one of you who are listening to me now to just try to imagine it for a second. Just try to imagine that you don't have electricity, that you can't play with your video games, that you can't watch your Netflix, that you don't have a refrigerator that can just open up and pull out a drink, or you can't eat your snacks, or you don't have a change of clothes, or you don't have a toilet where you can respond to the call of nature at. Just imagine living in the same house with 20, 30, maybe 50 other people sharing the same toilet, not having clean water to drink, not having enough to eat, staying in the same clothes on your back for days and days on end without a change of clothes, unable to shower. Just imagine that kind of life. This is what the people of Gaza are going through now. I want you to imagine the ill, the sick, the people who don't have access to their medicine, poor people who are on dialysis machines that are unable now to reach those machines, pregnant women who are going through labor, unborn children who are dying in their mother's wombs. I want you all to close your eyes for just a second and think about it. This is the hell that Jordan Peterson asked Benjamin Netanyahu to give to the people of Palestine. And I want you to ask yourselves and to appeal to your consciences, what did they do to deserve it? I'm not talking about Hamas. I'm talking about innocent civilians, people who did nothing to harm you. Is this how you root out the quote-unquote terrorists? Is this how you take them out? By destroying the whole city? You have precision weapons. You have smart weapons. You have satellites and drones and stuff. If you really wanted to take out Hamas, you would have used technology, but no. You want to kill as many Palestinians as possible. You want to drive them out of their land. This is the reason for this war. And if I'm going to put on my tinfoil hat, I think that you let them do what they did on the 7th of October. You let them get away with it. You wanted them to do it. So you would have an excuse to do all this to them, to drive them out. Just weeks before the 7th of October, Benjamin Netanyahu, at the Prime Assembly of the United Nations, showed a map of Israel that didn't have Gaza and didn't have the West Bank. He had a map of the country from the river to the sea. He wanted it purged of all Arabs and Muslims. And that's what he's doing. And this is what they call a genocide. And the funny thing is that they call anybody who criticizes Israel an anti-Semite. But the fact is, Palestinian people and Arab people like me, we're Semitic people too. That's what anthropologists classify Arabs as. We are Semitic as well. During World War II, the Jews went through the Holocaust. And there was an attempt by Europeans to wipe them out of existence. Now, they're reflecting that on us, on Arabs and on Muslims. Now the Palestinian people are going through a Holocaust. And the question I have for each and every person listening to this is, how is this justifiable? How is this fair? What did the little children who are dying today do to deserve this? What did they do to die before they grow up? What did they do to be deprived of their dreams? This is horrible. The issue we have is not with the Jewish people. It's not with the followers of Judaism. The problem we have is with Zionists, people who are calling for the replacement of the Arab residents of Palestine with Israelis coming in from all over the world and taking their lands. That is at the root of the issue. Zionists, whether they're Jews, Christians, or Arabs and Muslims, like many of our Arab governments today, those are the people that we have the issue with. But I can assure you, the problem isn't with Jewish people. Senator Bernie Sanders in the United States is a Jew, and he's against this. People like Jon Stewart, Noam Chomsky, those are Jews, but they're against the genocide of the Palestinian people. In our religion, Jews are people of the book. They're held in high regard in Islam. I grew up for a portion of my life in the West, and I still follow Western media, and I read a lot of things from America and from Europe, and I consider myself somebody who tries to keep up with the culture. And the Americans and Canadians and Europeans that I know are people who care about humanitarian causes. I've seen it where people go to the Amazon forests and tie themselves to trees so that they're not chopped down because they want to try and protect those trees and protect global balance. I've seen where protests and campaigns are waged to protect the whales and the dolphins and the animals that are threatened by extinct. And just so I clarify something, I'm all for that. I'm against chopping down the Amazon. I'm against killing all the whales. I'm against killing the polar bears. I'm against killing the koalas. But at the time when you care about dogs and cats and trees, there are human beings, people just like you, who are being wiped out in a genocide. And nobody gives up. Nobody cares. And that's what's happening. And that's what's happening. You are aiding the Israelis. You want to believe that the Israelis are the victims in this. They are not. They are not. I have never seen a victim bombing his oppressor 24/7 with the most advanced weapons in the world, dropping tons upon tons of explosives on them. I've never seen that before. You think that Israel is Jon Snow, but in fact, Israel is Ramsay Bolton, if you've watched Game of Thrones. You know that iconic scene Episode 9, Season 6 of Game of Thrones, when Jon Snow stands alone in face of a charging army. Every time I see Gaza standing alone in the face of these armies that are fighting her, I remember Jon Snow standing alone in the face of that charging army. And funny enough, I saw someone online who tried to play with this idea, and he put a little tag of the Israeli flag on the back of Jon Snow. How delusional are these people? You say that the Palestinians are an existential threat to Israel. How? Tell me how. I want someone to talk sense to me. Convince me. How are the Palestinians a threat? Do they have nukes? Do they have tanks? Do they have planes? Do they have missiles that can actually hurt you? What do the Palestinians have? Tell me, what do they have? What air force do they have? What kind of weaponry do they have? What kind of weapons of mass destruction do they have? They have nothing. The Israelis have nukes and tanks and missiles and planes, and they have every kind of weapon under the sun. And they're using it all without mercy to wipe out the Palestinian people. This is not a war. This is a genocide. This is one side using all his might to wipe out the other. It's not a fair fight. Yes, there may be some suffering on the Israeli side. And I empathize with every single innocent civilian on the other side. But if you look at this impartially and just use your heart and mind and think about it a little, one side is hurting a hell of a lot more than the other. A hell of a lot more. It's going to take forever to reconstruct Gaza again. The city has been rendered into nothing. I've seen on social media when some people were asking the Israelis to turn Gaza into a parking lot. Well, I got bad news for you. It's worse off than even a parking lot. Mission accomplished, right? You killed as many people as you wanted, right? But for how long? How many more people have to die? How many more children have to die? How many more women? How is this fair? You say you want peace. How can you achieve peace when you're killing the other side? There's nobody left for you to negotiate a peace with. How is this humane? In closing, because I don't want to take too much more of your time, I have a few messages for the people in the West. First, for the brave people who are taking to the streets and protesting and shouting and making their voices heard, I'd like to thank you. Each and every single one of you. You're good people. You're kind people. You're courageous people. You're empathic people. You're people who are still human. Even though you're not Arab, even though you're not Muslim, but you have a heart. And you felt the pain of your fellow human beings. And for that, I'd like to thank each and every one of you. There are brave people in the West who are standing up right now and saying no, and those people are being canceled, systemically canceled. You say that you have freedom of expression, freedom of press, but in fact, we've tested those during these times, and there is no such thing. There is no such thing. The people who speak out are being canceled. But I'd like to thank each and every one of the brave people who had the courage to side with their fellow human beings. For the others who are just following the Western media and believing the hogwash that they're being fed by the news agencies and by the 24/7 coverage, people who watch CNN and just believe whatever is being fed to them, or Fox News or whatever, I urge you to open your eyes. I urge you to use your minds. I urge you to think. Think. Ask yourselves the following question. Who are you not allowed to criticize? Because most likely, the people you are not allowed to criticize are the ones who are controlling you right now. And if you come to think of it, you would know who they are. The people who are in control of your very politicians and congressmen and senators and even your presidents. They are afraid to say a word until their masters give them the permission to speak. That's what's happening here. When you think about it, you will know who is in control of you right now. You're giving billions of dollars to Israel to bomb and armless, innocent people in response to what you call a terrorist attack. General George Washington, when he was fighting for his freedom and the freedom of the United States at the time, was considered a terrorist by the English. William Wallace, when he stood up for the freedom of Scotland against the English, was considered a terrorist. Nelson Mandela, when he took to arms to fight for the freedom of the South African people, he was considered a terrorist. I can go on and on, by the way. There are hundreds of freedom fighters in history who are now hailed as great heroes, but at the time, their oppressors called them terrorists. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Do I agree with the tactics that Hamas used? No. Do I think targeting civilians and kidnapping them is right? No, I don't. I don't agree with those tactics. I don't think what they did on the 7th of October was right. I think it was reckless. I think it was irresponsible. But to use that as an excuse to wipe out a whole people is totally wrong. In closing, I'd like to say that what brings us all together as human beings is far much more than what divides us. But if we are to follow our anger and our bloodthirst for revenge and our desire to kill one another, this will continue till the end of time. This will be an endless circle of blood and fire. Instead of that, why cannot we try to find peace, common understanding, a better future for our children? We don't need to continue doing this to one another. It's in your hands, people of the West. It's in your hands. You elected those officials. You can demand that they force a ceasefire, that they call for the end of the hostilities in the Palestinian lands, that the bombing stops, that the killing stops. You can demand this. And if you don't, and you choose to just ignore my words, yeah, you can do that. But someday, on your dying beds, you will look back and you'll remember that there were people calling out for help, begging for mercy, and you turned your backs and you ignored them. These are my thoughts that I wanted to share with anybody who would give me a listen. And we're praying for peace. We're praying that the hostilities end soon. We're praying for a ceasefire. We're praying for a stop of all of these atrocities. I'm hoping that the children of Palestine very, very soon get their necessities: food, water, medicine, fuel. If you like what I said, please share it with someone else. If you have a different opinion, feel free to leave it for me in the comments. I'd be glad to read it, and if it's something I can reply to, I'll be glad to. And in closing, peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum.